Hi, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney and a guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. Does anyone really ever get away with murder? Let's talk about that. There is no such thing as the perfect crime. Today we're going to talk specifically about the crime of murder and how murder can have devastating effects on a person's physical and emotional well-being. And I'm talking about the person committing, not the victim, which can ultimately lead to their capture and prosecution. Human life is sacred. I think everybody understands that. It's one of the few things you can take from someone that you can't give back. Since life is precious and we all recognize that, the act of taking a life is not morally neutral. Even in situations where a life is taken as a result of self-defense, the person who takes that life may suffer consequences of a mental and emotional nature. They may replay the event in their mind hundreds of times. They lose sleep if you listen to survivor stories. There are people who scientists tell us do not suffer these issues because they're sociopaths. Sociopaths, the common wisdom is, they don't have a conscience. I take a different view. We are all endowed by our Creator with the knowledge of right and wrong, and we know that it's wrong to take a life because we all have a conscience. I believe sociopaths simply do not listen to their conscience. That's my belief, but I'm not a professionally educated psychologist, so you may wish to discount that opinion. But other than the rare sociopath, even psychopaths recognize that they are doing wrong, and they often leave clues that lead to their capture and that when viewed in the context of their crime make no intellectual sense. In other words, there's no reason to leave that clue. They only make sense when they're viewed in the context of a guilty conscience or sociopathy. Taking a human life can have a profound and complex effect on a person's psyche, and the psychological impact can vary from one individual to another, and in significant ways. It's important to note that the consequences are influenced by factors such as the circumstances surrounding the act, the individual's mental health, personal history, their coping mechanisms, and certain factors related to the victim, like, for example, if they have a terminal disease. Here are some general psychological effects that individuals who have taken a human life have experienced. First, there is guilt and remorse. Many individuals experience overwhelming guilt and remorse for taking a life, especially if the act was intentional and perceived as unjust. This is especially true where a failure of anger management and rage lead to that killing. Think of all the trials and sentencing you may have seen on YouTube, court TV, Law and Crime, where the killer says, "If I could take it back, I would." But we all understand you can't go back in time. You can't take it back. Some killers suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Perpetrators of violent acts, including taking a life, may develop symptoms of PTSD. They have flashbacks, they have nightmares, they have intense anxiety, and that can persist, and it can be triggered by reminders of the traumatic event. For example, a car backfiring or fireworks. These feelings often haunt thousands of veterans who saw combat, even though in those situations it was often kill or be killed. Survivor guilt is a real thing. Then there is depression. The weight of the act and its consequences can lead to feelings of deep sadness and despair, especially if someone feels the police are closing in. The individual may struggle with the moral and emotional implications of their behavior, and all too often people try and ameliorate their depression by talking with people about what they did. And the more people they talk to, the more likely it is that they will be captured and punished. And then there's anxiety and fear, primarily the fear of legal consequences or retaliation from family members of the victim. A sense of impending doom can contribute to chronic anxiety, the feeling of constantly looking over your shoulder and wondering when they're coming for you. Individuals can live in a constant state of fear of being discovered or facing those repercussions. Even people who only commit property crimes, like the famed bank robber John Conrad, who lived 50 years under a different name and only confessed to his true identity and what he had done, robbing a bank in Ohio, when he was on his deathbed. He had the weight of a terrible burden on his back for many years and never knowing when the knock on the door would come. His full name was Theodore John Conrad, and he was only 20 years old when he robbed the Society National Bank in Cleveland on July 11, 1969. According to the U.S. Marshals, Conrad worked as a teller at the bank, and on the day of the robbery, he stashed $215,000, or about $1.7 million in today's currency, in a paper bag and simply walked out the door. Because the robbery happened on a Friday, the bank was not aware of anything amiss until the following Monday morning when they checked the vault and found the money gone. And of course, at about the same time, Conrad was gone. Unsurprisingly, he didn't show up for work, and he had a 2-day head start on law enforcement. He had managed to avoid capture for nearly 52 years by, before he committed the robbery, going to the Social Security agency and getting a new Social Security number in a new name, Thomas Randell. So marshals in Cleveland discovered that this guy, Thomas Randell, was in fact Conrad. Randell had lived in Lynnfield, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston, for nearly 50 years since the 1970s until he died of lung cancer at the age of 71 in May. And as a result, he was never brought to justice, but you can tell there was a lot of implications for his life and the life of his family that he also kept the secret from. Then there's social isolation, and I think Randell is a good example of that. The guilt and shame associated with taking a life can lead individuals to withdraw from social interactions. They may struggle with feelings of alienation and difficulty connecting with other people. Often people who escape punishment for the murder, like O.J. Simpson allegedly did, wind up with their lives a financial wreck and isolated from their family and children. Consider the impact on Alex Murdaugh of his combined thefts and murder. There's a guy who's not going to be welcome at any Thanksgiving dinner the family has from now until the end of time. That is, even assumes he's able to get out of prison. There is a profound loss of self-esteem, and that's because committing an act like taking a life is a profound violation of societal and moral norms and can result in a significant loss of self-esteem. Individuals struggle to reconcile their actions with their own self-perception of themselves as a nice person. No one wants to think of themselves as a murderer. Look at the way Jessie Kerchesky clings to the idea that she's factually innocent in spite of the mountain of evidence of her thefts and poisoning. Then there's nightmare and sleep disturbances. Disturbing dreams and difficulty sleeping are common after traumatic events. The mind may replay the effect and the event during sleep, contributing to ongoing psychological distress. Judge Clifton Newman made reference to this in his sentencing of Alex Murdaugh.
But within your own soul, you have to deal with that. And I know you have to see Paul and Maggie during the night times when you're attempting to go to sleep. I'm sure they come and visit you. I'm sure.
All day and every night.
Sure.
Another thing that murderers face is emotional numbness. Some individuals may experience this sense of detachment as a coping mechanism. This can make it challenging to form meaningful connections or engage in healthy emotional processing, and it may allow them to rationalize and excuse their conduct. Then there are people who have thoughts of self-harm. The intense emotional pain and despair associated with taking a life leads some people to contemplate or even attempt self-harm as a way of escaping the consequences of what they've done. And it's crucial to recognize that individuals who take a human life may not necessarily experience all of these effects, and some may develop coping mechanisms that help them manage their emotions. So sociopaths certainly spring to mind there. Others may seek therapy or mental health support to address the psychological aftermath of their actions, believing in the doctor-patient privilege, which, by the way, doesn't exist in Alabama. The impact on a person's psyche is complex, and it's an individualized process, and the impacts are there. Knowing how taking a human life affects a person's emotional outlook, we should next consider how difficult it is to get away with something like murder. Historically, several factors and mistakes have contributed to the capture and prosecution of murderers. While each case is unique, some common errors include these. First, there's the Burger Catastrophe. Now, here is a guy who understands the entire process of how police go about catching people who are, for example, serial killers. He understands the investigative process. He probably understands the Reed method. He knows that the first thing you do is lawyer up. He understands how, in the past, many people have been caught and convicted. And it's obvious that he planned his murders well in advance. But in spite of that, he left evidence at the scene of the crime that tied him directly to what happened. And failing to clean up or dispose of evidence like fingerprints, DNA, or personal belongings can usually link a perpetrator to the scene. Brian Kohberger left the scabbard of the knife he used in the killing at the scene, and that scabbard had DNA on it. And Kohberger was a criminal justice major and knew how these things worked. And then there is the opposite of Kohberger, its lack of planning. Impulsive acts without proper planning lead to mistakes, leaving behind clues that investigators use to track down the murderer. The Son of Sam killer is a good example of this. The Son of Sam killer apparently forgot to bring change for the meter and was tied to murders by a parking ticket. A witness, learning that there had been a crime or murder in her area, told police about a man who'd been hanging around a car that had multiple tickets on it. They tracked the tickets down, they found the car, they found the Son of Sam, and he was arrested as a result. And then there are witness testimonies. Witnesses who can provide descriptions of the suspect or recall specific details about the crime often aid law enforcement in their investigations. For example, on August 7th, 1987, there was a guy by the name of Rogers who picked up Jennifer Lisa Smith and stabbed her in his car. Smith fell onto the road and her screams grabbed the attention of patrons in a nearby restaurant who came to her aid. Rogers quickly drove off, but he was chased by another man who noted his plate number and address and handed them over to police. The notorious Oregon killer was arrested based on this information, and he currently sits on Oregon's death row for the murder of 6 other women as well as the murder of Smith. And then there are inconsistent alibis. Murderers who provide inconsistent or implausible alibis may arouse suspicion and become targets for further investigation. In one case, Wallingford police were bothered about discrepancies in a series of alibis given by a guy by the name of Kevin Benefield. This happened 26 years ago. The discrepancies were there, but they didn't have enough to bring him in and charge him. He had killed a woman by the name of Barbara Pelkey, but they didn't, like I said, have enough incriminating evidence to arrest him then. The detective, whose name was Fairchild, said that there was a discrepancy between the alibi Benefield gave and the account his girlfriend provided. Eventually, as the case was worked as a cold case, they were able to provide additional evidence, and he was arrested, and they learned that, among other things, he had been frequently basically coming to Pelkey and bumming cigarettes from her, and eventually this fact led to his arrest. Then there's Alex Murdaugh. He planned his alibi very carefully, but he was tripped up by his son's video that was sent to his friend. And he was also tripped up by the fact that he asked the maid to take note of the fact of the time when he arrived. When you're coming to visit your mom, you don't really think about what time you're arriving and what time you're leaving. And so that drew attention to the fact that he was setting up an alibi. There are so many ways that people make mistakes in how they set up an alibi, and that often leads to them being caught. And then there are communication mistakes, basically talking about what you've done. And that can be through written messages, text messages, phone calls. Anytime you leave digital traces that investigators can use to identify and locate you, you are making a huge communication mistake. But perhaps the most serious mistake in recent memory was Dennis Rader. He was known as the BTK killer, bind, torture, kill. And he had a huge ego. And this was in Kansas. And he wrote letters to the media bragging about his murders and even gave himself his own nickname, BTK. In one letter to a TV station, he suggested that BTK killer, standing for bind, torture, and kill, was a better way to refer to him than the way that the media had been. Rader killed 10 people between 1974 and 1991, and he very nearly got away with it. The police had almost given up on catching him, considering it a cold case. But Rader had this psychological need for attention, which I think springs from a guilty conscience, and so he started communicating with the media again 13 years after his final murder. He wrote to a newspaper claiming to be the BTK killer and supplying details and photographs of his crimes as proof. Rader also wrote letters to TV stations and to the police themselves. He wanted to send the police a copy of some information that he had on a floppy disk, but he wasn't sure it was safe. Not seeming to understand that the police were trying to catch him, he did what an honest citizen would do. He asked the police if it would be okay to send them this disk. The police answered Rader in a newspaper ad telling him it would be perfectly safe for him to send them a floppy disk. Rader sent the disk to the TV station, and the police digital forensic investigators immediately went through it and checked it for hidden data, stuff that had been erased, and they found metadata from a deleted Microsoft Word file that was still on the disk that gave them the name Dennis and the church where Rader served as the president of the church council. Now, you may think that's interesting that you've got somebody who's a killer and he's president of the church council. But the fact of the matter is that the guy, Robert Courtney, who essentially diluted chemotherapy and wound up killing numerous patients as a result, even though he was never charged with murder, he was also very prominent in his church, and he used many of the proceeds that he got from diluting this chemotherapy to fund his church. I think this is a way that people often go about trying to purge their sins, and I think it's a good idea to clear your skirts with the good Lord, but in so doing, they wound up essentially drawing attention to themselves. So the first thread of an investigation in that case was derived from this letter that was sent, and then the police traced his car, eventually finding DNA evidence that would convict him. He's still in prison. He's serving 10 consecutive life sentences because at the time he was prosecuted and at the time he committed his crimes, Kansas did not have a death penalty. He's one of the reasons that it now does have a death penalty. And I would add that Kansas has the death penalty. It has been abolished and reinstated 3 times, and I believe that Rader is one of the main reasons why he was reinstated, or why it was reinstated. And then there are forensic advances. Advances in forensic technology, hair, fiber, DNA especially, are very useful in solving murders. Improvements in DNA analysis have helped link suspects to crime scenes. The use of forensic genetic genealogy became widely known after the Golden State Killer in 2018. And of course, Brian Kohberger is sitting in a jail cell right now because they used forensic genealogy to track his DNA to his father, who then essentially led them to Kohberger. Then there is associating with known criminals. It's another way murderers get caught. Ties to other criminals or involvement in criminal networks increase the chances of being identified and apprehended. Here you should think of Charlie Adelson and his use of his girlfriend's former boyfriend, and the father of her child, as a hitman. And normal people just don't have a hitman on the Rolodex. And when they get involved with criminals, they find out that it absolutely is true that there is no honor among thieves and, for that matter, gang members. And then there are behavioral changes. People often notice that there are sudden changes in behavior or lifestyle after someone commits a murder. And that can attract the attention of people who know them, and that often can lead investigators to look for them. I think Murdaugh, trying to commit self-harm in such a haphazard way, drew a lot more attention to himself after the murders of his children, or his child and his wife. And then there's surveillance footage. Surveillance cameras in public areas capture images of footage of suspects, and they provide crucial evidence. There are cameras everywhere these days. Philadelphia detectives were recently able to quickly arrest a man in the murder and burning of a female pediatrician by viewing surveillance video from stores and the hospital that captured this guy getting into the doctor's home and later getting into his truck. And it's important to note that the effectiveness of all of these investigative tools and the fact that all of the psychological pressure that builds up inside someone who has done this kind of thing, law enforcement agencies use a combination of forensic science, investigative techniques, and technology to solve crimes and bring these perpetrators to justice, which is exactly what we pay them to do. The long and short of it is that in most cases, even people who are very smart, very disciplined, and, obviously homicidal, wind up getting caught because they miss one thing. When you commit a murder, you're not going up against one person. There may only be one detective assigned to the case, but there's a battalion of forensic investigators and police who do interviews. They talk to people in the neighborhood. And even though you don't see them, people look out their window all the time and they see things, and they are more than happy to talk to police. I think for the most part, people, when they think they have an opportunity to help solve a crime, are more than happy to do that and often try to do that. As a result, people get caught. So can you ever really get away with murder? No. Even if you don't get prosecuted, you're going to suffer some kind of mental distress as a result. And of course, there are people who escape punishment in this life, but they will not escape punishment in the next life. And I believe that eventually all accounts get squared. And that's how I have tried to live my life, so that I would not have an account to settle at my end of lifetime. So that's what I have for you today. It's a little different than some of the stuff that I often do, but I've been doing so many of these murder cases that I just sat down one day and said, what makes people think they can get away with murder? I don't really have any idea what it is that they think that allows them to commit these kinds of acts. But for everything that you think of, there are 5 things that you don't think of, and it's the 5 things that they don't think of that winds up getting them caught. At any rate, if you have any comments on this, leave them in the comments down below, or as always, you can email me. Thank you so much for watching. Be kind, be considerate, do something nice for somebody today, and come back here and see me tomorrow at the beach. If you like this video, here are a few others you might try, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a terrific day, guys.